Congressman McCaul, thank you so much for joining us today. Obviously,
Thanks,
big
Tom.
news in Washington this week is the House beginning the impeachment process of DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Given your legal background, what specific actions or inactions from the secretary do you think warrant his impeachment, aside from his rescission of the MPP policy, which you've talked about as being one of those key reasons that he should be impeached?
Right. I think it's a failure to follow and execute the law, the failure to detain and remove those coming into the country illegally, which is what Remain in Mexico did. And on day one, he rescinded that policy and went back to well, quite frankly, we've never experienced this kind of lack of law enforcement where you have 8 million people encounters with no legal status. You've had over 300 on the terror watch list come in, and we've had 150,000 people dead now due to fentanyl deaths, many in the Austin area, by the way. I can't get into names, but people, friends of my kids from Westlake High School, they took what they thought was Xanax, was laced with fentanyl, and they don't wake up. But going back to what the founding fathers envisioned, they didn't even envision a specific violation of a federal criminal statute. They didn't have very many at that time. They talked about things like abuse of power and neglect of duty, dereliction of duty. Hamilton talked in the Federalist Papers about injuries done immediately to society itself, which clearly there's been a lot of damage to the fabric of America over the last 2.5, 3 years due to the secretary's inaction and failure to follow the law, and also his just abuse of power. I tell you, back home, I deal as chairman of foreign affairs with a lot of other issues like Israel and Russia and Ukraine and China and the threat to Taiwan, but this is always the number one issue, is the threat to the southern border, and how can we fix it? So I'm a voice for about 800,000 people. They're very loud and clear what they want me to say up here, and that is that they're fed up. They think this man should be removed from office, and they want him impeached.
Typically, cabinet members are enforcers of policy decisions by the administration at large. Is impeachment the right move in response to this issue, which when many see that Mayorkas is carrying out President Biden's policies?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think Mayorkas he's a smart man. He was a U.S. attorney in California like I was in Texas, and he knows what he's doing. This is not done by accident, it's done by design. I think he had every intention to rescind this law. And I personally think it was his advice, his guidance to the president that led to this rescission of policy. We're not looking at throwing a lot more money down there at the border. We've already spent a lot of money. If they need more, then I consider that. But we really want these fundamental changes in policy that have led to the pull factor, the magnet that's bringing in all these people. Rather than pushing our border out further south, we're bringing it into the United States. I don't know how we're going to absorb 8 million people with no legal status. And all they're going to do is go to criminal enterprises like, MS-13, cartels in the United States, sex, human trafficking, largest trafficking event of my lifetime. But to answer your question, I think this man is personally responsible for the policy changes, and he has to own it. And we're going to speak on behalf of the American people. Now, do I think this is going to go anywhere in the Senate? Probably not. But I think the American people deserve to have their voices heard on this subject.
Congressman, which do you think would have more immediate results for the country when it comes to border policy, the impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas or congressional reform on border policy? I know that's something that you all are working on, but should Congress be more focused on trying to get the Secure the Border Act across the finish line?
I almost see them working in tandem together because it gives us leverage and strength to say, look, the American people are fed up with your conduct, with your abuse of power, your neglect of duty, and they want you to do your job. So we're going to impeach in the House. It's not going to go anywhere in the Senate probably, but you need to come to the table and change these policies now. And now is the time, as we're facing a potential looming government shutdown, which I never like those. All that does is hurts our national defense, our military. I'd far prefer to have a continuing resolution where we can get the business of government done, fund the government, and include a major border policy, national security change of policy that will fix this border. We had this thing done. When I chaired Homeland Security Committee, we literally had it to the point where we had stopped the flow into the country. We were going to build a detention facility in southern Mexico on the Guatemalan border that would process these individuals. And we finally had a system that was going to work. And then Mayorkas came in and changed everything.
On that note, do you agree with your fellow Republicans, many of whom just traveled to Eagle Pass in this last week? Do you agree that the government shutdown is the ends that justify the means in terms of trying to gain leverage on getting the Secure the Border Act passed?
I mean, I understand the sentiment, and I always appreciate my colleagues' points of view. I don't think shutting down the government is ever a constructive idea. I think the better idea would be to have a short-term resolution, get these funding measures. We need to work. We don't need the government shut down where we're not working. We need to get to work under a short-term CR, get the business done of the federal government, and get the border fixed as well in that package within a month's time. We can do this for the American people. A shutdown is only going to hurt our national security at a very dangerous time. As I sit as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, looking at a war in Israel, a war in Russia, Ukraine, a potential war in the Pacific, is not the time to be shutting down the government, in my point of view. I think we can get all these things done constructively by an open government process. So that's where I am on the issue. And I hope that's where we are. We're going to find out relatively soon, Monica, as tomorrow could be the day we'll find out if we're shut down or if we're going into a resolution.
I know you, of course, are sensitive to the foreign policy issues at stake here. On the line, aid for Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel. Do you see, though, a path forward for Republicans on addressing this, very important border security legislation? Do you see that becoming a separate issue? Because historically, as you know, passing immigration and border security policy has been a heavy lift in Congress. And then when it's tied to this foreign aid, it is the stakes are even higher.
It's I've dealt with it for 10 terms in Congress. Probably one of the most difficult things you can do. The reason why you're never going to please everybody. And when it comes to immigration, we passed HR 2, right? And my migrant protection protocol, Remain in Mexico bill that I marked up out of Foreign Affairs is in that bill. If that got passed alone, I would be very happy. But that won't make everybody happy. So when it comes to immigration, you can't make everybody happy. But you have to find the more important policy changes that make it worthwhile when you don't have control of the Senate or the White House. You can't operate in a vacuum. You have to be in reality that we don't have the Senate or White House. Let's get as much good policy done as we can when it comes to the border. I'm leading a delegation of Texans down there to the border. But more importantly, with my foreign affairs hat, I'm going down to Mexico City. After Secretary Blinken and Mayorkas went down there and caused a lot of damage by promising, billions of dollars, lifting sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba, by the way, I'm going to go down to say, how can we restore some of these policies that worked? This is another factor, Monica, is we can't pass these policy changes and then expect Mexico to, immediately, genuflect. I mean, we're going to have to work with Mexico and our partners to the south and Central America to get some of these policy changes done, as we had in the prior administration. So that is what I'll be doing, to go down to work with the leaders down there, and also the presidential candidates in Mexico that we know will be coming into office soon to take President AMLO's place.
I do want to turn now to the conflict in the Middle East. Secretary Blinken just wrapped up his trip there, and he's called for more steps to protect civilians. I know in the past you have not been supportive of a full ceasefire, but what do you think Israel and, in partnership with the United States, should do to protect the lives of innocent civilians here?
Well, we always want to protect innocent civilians. I think the problem has been that Hamas uses those civilians and hostages as human shields. The hospital being a good example, their military base of operations was run out of that major hospital in Gaza, putting everybody in the hospital in danger. That's how they operate. So it's very hard to go to war against Hamas when they're putting human shields all around them. So my view is to let Israel get this thing done as quickly as possible, and that will end up saving lives down the road. Now, I think the real discussion is going to be, what do we do post-conflict? Because I do think Israel, the IDF, is making significant progress in southern Gaza, where you're going to have a humanitarian zone set up by the international community to deal with these innocent civilians who are not in their homes. And that's when the international community comes together. But then we need to look at the foreign policy. And I know that the Arab nations that want to help, like the Saudis and the UAE, and other countries like Jordan and Egypt, very much want a solution to this problem, this age-old problem. And that would be the state of Israel and some sort of Palestinian state of governance, but from the Palestinian people to govern themselves. Israel has no appetite to govern Gaza. They don't want to. They want the people of the Palestinians to govern themselves without Hamas. And that's the key, without Hamas. They cannot govern themselves with Hamas there. Hamas has to be eliminated, then they can self-govern. And then possibly you got to deal with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And how do you move those two groups together? So it's very complicated. But I think now, with a conflict like this, you also have an opportunity to maybe finally bring some sort of state solution to the Palestinian and Israeli territories.
The attacks against ships in the Red Sea are being blamed on Houthi rebels, including some on an American warship. What are the challenges in responding to those attacks? I imagine a lot of Americans are wondering, why don't we just take these rebels out? Is it that simple?
Well, I would say, with anything, deterrence is key. You project strength, you avoid conflict and war. You project weakness, as I argue we did after Afghanistan. You invite conflict and war, which we've seen with Russia and Ukraine. We're seeing this with China and Taiwan. And now we're seeing it with Iran through its proxies in Israel. Houthi rebels are a proxy of Iran in Yemen. They are firing indiscriminately at both our commercial ships and other commercial ships and our battleships. This administration took the foreign terrorist organization designation off the Houthi rebels, which was a sign of weakness. We should never have done that. And then we didn't adequately respond when they did attack our ships. What's happening now is that you're going to see an increase in prices because the commercial goods, they go and transverse in those ships. They're going to have to move the routes now around Africa as opposed to through the Red Sea. It's going to change the prices. We already have inflation, and we don't want to see prices go up. And certainly with energy prices, you're probably going to see a spike in energy prices as well. So this is not some isolated event in the Middle East. It's going to impact Americans back home if we don't get more serious about the Houthi rebels and say enough's enough. And we need the international community to come together and say to them very strongly, we're not going to put up with this. Also, Iranian ships are in the Red Sea conducting these operations with the Houthi rebels. And I believe we've been way too weak in our response to them. They only understand one thing in that part of the world, and that's power and strength. And if they see a lack of resolve and weakness, they will take full advantage of it, which is precisely what they're doing.
All right, one last quick question, if I may, on some state news. When Speaker Johnson was in Eagle Pass, I asked him if he supported Texas's efforts to pass their own immigration enforcement law, even though that's expected to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. You know how they ruled in Arizona versus USA back in 2012. Do you think that this law is constitutional? Do you support Texas's efforts to secure its own border?
I support anything Texas can do to support our border. I think ultimately, under the Constitution, it's very clear it's a federal responsibility. We have the supremacy clause. However, the problem has been for too many years, the federal government has abdicated its responsibility on this issue. And so anything the state of Texas can do to help prevent more drugs, more fentanyls, more illegals, more criminals, more terrorists coming in the United States. I fully support that. From a legal standpoint, I don't know how that's going to wind up in the courts, but I share their frustration. I think this legislation is a creation of the frustration that they're feeling in our home state, in the state legislature. What more can I do? The governor called me and said, yeah, lead chaired Homeland Security Committee. What more can I do? And it's very hard because it is a federal responsibility. And again, this administration, going back to the impeachment, have abdicated that important responsibility. The chairman of the Homeland Security Committee and the secretary of the Homeland Security Committee is tasked with the oath of office to protect the American people from all threats, foreign and domestic. And we are not protecting threats from foreign adversaries at that border. And this secretary has wholly failed in that objective and that oath of office. And that's why he will be impeached.